Okay, this screencast is going to begin with the Harlem Renaissance, and it's actually going to finish out the rest of our Chapter 18 notes, so you should be using your Chapter 18 outlines. Before we get to the actual event that was the Harlem Renaissance, I want to kind of pick up and review a few facts about just African Americans and their experience during this point in history. So recall one of the last things we talked about was the Great Migration, which started during World War I, in which hundreds of thousands of African Americans would move out of the South into developing cities in the urban North, mainly just to leave all of the racial injustice happening in the South, but also they're going to the North because of all the job opportunities available there. Just because things were not as bad as they were in terms of injustice and prejudice in the South, things were still really bad for the African Americans who were moving into the North. They were not really welcomed with open arms, and they're not going to be given necessarily full equality as citizens. They're not going to be treated as well as they want to be treated. And so there's still a lot of things that need to happen in terms of civil rights, and that will start happening over the next several decades. But we do know the move took place, and we do know that they were in search for a better life, although it didn't always work out how they had hoped. Because of that, and because of the injustice that still existed in the country at the time, some groups are going to start developing, some that even exist today, like the first one we're going to talk about, that kind of made their goals to address some of the inequalities and injustices African Americans were experiencing. So one of the first organizations that's going to be founded a little bit before this time, but around this time, is one of the most prominent civil rights organizations that still exists today, and that is the NAACP. And I do want you to know what that acronym stands for, and that's written on the screen. So it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And their main goal within this organization was to protest racial violence in the United States and basically call for equality and for African Americans to be treated equally in a white-dominated society. And they just represented a more vocal, outspoken voice within the African American community. And they are still a very prominent organization even until this day. So you know that they definitely made a name for themselves. Okay, so this is like around the first time we start seeing the NAACP. Now I want to compare that to another organization that developed around this time that's not going to have the same type of lasting impact, still does have an impact for sure, but not the same type. And they're going to kind of represent a different voice within the African American community. So the next organization we're going to talk about was called the UNIA, and that stands for the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And this organization was found by a man named Marcus Garvey, and his name is spelled for you on the screen. He was actually an immigrant from Jamaica. So he was a black man, but he wasn't actually born in the United States, but he was an African man living in the United States, and he believed that African Americans needed to rise up and stand up for themselves by separating themselves from white society and actually building their own society separately. So he is calling for, a different type of justice in his eyes, but he's not actually wanting to create this integrated, coexisting black and white society. He's wanting African Americans to stand up for themselves, but also to separate themselves from white society. And actually, the way he wanted this to happen was that he wanted all of his kind of followers and supporters to return to Africa. In his mind, Africa was home, and he wanted to do what he thought was the right thing, which is to basically go back to Africa and overthrow any sort of European, controlling country that was there, because, Africa was being heavily colonized by this point by European countries, and to kind of make a claim for themselves there. This is not going to get very far. For most of the people living in America at this point who were African American, Africa was not home. And unfortunately, Mr. Garvey himself will later be convicted of mail fraud and do some jail time. So the movement, his specific movement, doesn't really, get off the ground. It never really picks up a lot of momentum. However, one of the things that is founded in his movement is this idea of Black pride and African culture and reverence for that culture. And that is something that did kind of continue out of the movement. So even though there was not a huge flux of people traveling out of the U.S., and even though he doesn't himself find himself very successful, there is definitely a legacy within his movement in terms of the Black pride. Okay, so now that we kind of just look at some examples of some of the things that African Americans are going through during this time, I want to talk about one of the biggest kind of artistic aspects of African American culture that happens to take place during the 20s, and that is the Harlem Renaissance. So as we discussed, many people moving into cities in the North, one of the most targeted neighborhoods here in which a lot of African Americans migrated to over this point was a neighborhood in New York called Harlem. And basically by the 20s, Harlem becomes the world's largest urban Black community in the country, kind of considered like the Black capital of the United States. And just like many, urban neighborhoods during this point, things aren't all, roses and butterflies during this time in Harlem. Even though it is a central city for where this movement's going to take place, there was poverty, there was injustice, there was prejudice, there was violence. It wasn't a super, it wasn't an awesome, it wasn't like safe or anything like that. Fully safe, and it wasn't, filled with justice or anything like that. So there was definitely people suffering in Harlem, but from kind of this dark side of the city where people are suffering due to violence and poverty, we're going to see a literary and artistic movement develop that really celebrates African American culture. And that movement is called the Harlem Renaissance. So it's going to be kind of defined as this is my PowerPoint, this creative movement, this literary and artistic movement that flowered out of the kind of urbanization problems within Harlem, New York, the overcrowding, the poverty. And it's going to celebrate, the movement is going to focus on and celebrate African American culture. So we're going to talk about a couple of examples, mainly writing, acting, and music that were focused on within this movement. So I think more than anything, people would argue that the Harlem Renaissance was focused on writing and the written expression, basically, whether it was short stories, books, poems. Basically, people out of Harlem are going to start writing about their experiences as African Americans living in the United States. And one of the examples of these writers was Mr. Langston Hughes. He is probably the movement's best-known poet. He writes many poems describing just the difficulty and the difficult circumstances that working-class African Americans have to face. And his poems, many of them were like short and sweet, but they got right to the point, and they kind of flowed to the beat of like jazz music. Y'all will most likely, if you haven't already, read some of his poetry in your English classes this year. We also see African American performers, and I don't just mean, musical performers, but in this case, I'm talking about theater. African Americans were not once allowed really to perform in, New York or, any other places across the country, mainstream theater, any sort of shows. And Paul Robeson's going to become one of the first, African American actors to perform a Shakespearean play. He's going to star in Othello, and it becomes widely successful, and he's very, accredited for his success within that play. I don't really need you to know what play it is, but I just kind of wanted to give an example of an actor that came out of this movement in New York. And then, of course, probably most importantly, there's jazz music. And we first want to point out, since we are good Louisianians, that we know that jazz music was not born in Harlem, but rather jazz music was born in New Orleans. And don't let anyone tell you any differently than that, okay? But many jazz musicians did leave New Orleans, moved to some cities in the north, whether it was Chicago or New York, and jazz music's going to become very, very popular. It is the sound and the music of the 20s, okay, and it's very high in demand at many of these clubs and speakeasies that would host music and musical groups. So I wanted to give a few examples here. Of course, Louis Armstrong, very famous trumpeter or trumpet player out of New Orleans, who was very celebrated because of his trumpet playing and his musical abilities, but also because of his scat music. He would kind of do the sounds that, there weren't really words, but he would sing different notes, make different noises, and that is it's called scat music. Then there is Duke Ellington, who became, whose really group became very, very successful at the Cotton Club, which was one of the biggest and most well-known speakeasies in New York. He led a huge group, and he was a composer, and he was a very successful jazz musician. And then Bessie Smith was a famous female blues singer. So she'd be one of the singers who would sing this type of music. And anyway, these are just 3 examples, but all of these individuals, and really just the music itself, became a huge part of the jazz movement and the jazz era. And again, jazz music just became very, very popular during this time. So even though we see, the kind of what I want you to gather and what I was trying to say earlier is that because the African American experience was not that great during this point in history, that's what makes the Harlem Renaissance really stand apart as a beautiful movement that kind of comes out of the bad experiences that are happening across the United States. It makes the movement stand out even more because of its beauty. And that's going to have a big effect on African American culture, and we'll see that continue to thrive throughout the units we discuss this school year. But what is about to come crashing down is the United States economy, because we've kind of gotten to the peak of the Roaring 20s, and we're going to be beginning Chapter 19 starting next week with the Great Depression. So we'll see that transition occur. So please write down any questions you have, and we'll discuss that in class on Friday. I hope you all have a great day, be safe, and I'll see you all on Friday.